Women and Apartheid by Meghan, Healy, Clancy. Published online 28th June 2017. Summary. Apartheid, the system of racial and ethnic separation introduced in South Africa in 1948, was a gendered project. The immediate goal of the white Afrikaner men who led the apartheid state was to control black men, to turn black men from perceived political and criminal threats into compliant workers. Under apartheid, African men would travel to work for whites in towns and on mines, but their homes would be in rural ethnic reserves, known as homelands or Bantustans. This vision depended on the labors of African women. While their men migrated to work, women were to maintain their families in the increasingly overcrowded and desolate countryside, reproducing the workforce cheaply. This vision depended on the labors of African women. While their men migrated to work, women were to maintain their families in the increasingly overcrowded and desolate countryside, reproducing the workforce cheaply while instilling a sense of ethnic difference in their children. Colored, i.e. mixed race, and Indian women were similarly charged with social reproduction on a shoestring in segregated rural and urban areas. White women uniquely had the franchise and freedom of movement, but they were also constrained by sexually repressive laws. Apartheid's gendered vision of production and social reproduction faced continual resistance, and it ultimately failed. First, it failed because African women increasingly moved from rural areas to urban centers, despite laws limiting their mobility. Second, it failed because some women organized across ethnic and racial lines. They often organized as mothers, demanding a better world for a new generation. Both their nationally and internationally resident campaigns against past laws, educational and healthcare inequities, police brutality, and military conscription, and the fact that their collective organization gradually undermined apartheid. Officials generally underestimated the power of women, and their contributions have continued to be underappreciated since apartheid ended in 1994. Because women's political style emphasized personal and familial concerns, but because apartheid was premised on transforming how families lived, actions of women in fact undermined the system from its core. State interventions into the formation and lives of families were central to apartheid, the legal regime of racial and ethnic division that ruled South Africa between the election of Daniel Malan in 1948 and the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994. With legacies enduring through the present. From the regime's inception under the leadership, ideas of racial purity, sexual restraint, and patriarchy were intertwined. Apartheid's immediate goal was to control black men, turning them from political threats into compliant workers to ensure South Africa's development to an industrialized state in which whites would enjoy growing wealth and political hegemony. But apartheid could only work by also controlling women. Apartheid leaders were concerned with black women, a category that includes women classified as African, Indian, or colored, as well as with white women, both Afrikaners, like apartheid leaders, and women from British and other European backgrounds. Officials saw women as central to creating properly ethnicized and racialized subjects who would fill their prescribed niches in an economy and polity controlled by white men. Black women undermined the visions of apartheid from its onset. First, many black women refused to be held in place. African women were supposed to remain confined to rural ethnic reserves, known as homelands or Bantustans, deeply raising compliant workers and ethnic subjects there, while their husbands labored for low wages for whites in towns and on the mines. But from apartheid's start, women increasingly went to town. African women who stayed on the reserves did not all submit quietly to apartheid's demands either. Rural women organized resistance in both political organizations and religious groups was formidable, attracting both state oppression and gradual reforms. As key urban women activists were forced to the countryside in line with apartheid's strategies of banning activists, the liveliness of rural resistance only grew. Across South Africa, across lines of race and class, activist women came together to resist apartheid. While they also worked with men, women particularly organized as mothers. A fitting riposte to a regime rooted in restructuring families. Even as their campaigns attracted national and international support, apartheid officials underestimated their impact, generally seeing women as less threatening political actors than men. Since apartheid ended in 1994, women's contributions to the regime's collapse have continued to attract less popular and scholarly attention than men's contributions. Yet controlling personal lives and transforming families were core objectives of apartheid policies. Through both individual and collective action, the gendered life choices of many diverse women therefore undermined apartheid from within. Male-led nationalist movements and the roots of apartheid. In May 1948, the National Party, NP, won the South African general election, inaugurating the era of apartheid. Apartness in Afrikaans, the Dutch-derived language of the NP's Afrikaner leaders. The National Party heightened the segregationist policies that had ruled the Union of South Africa since its 1910 formation as a British dominion, ruled by an alliance of British and Afrikaner men. Apartheid added an ideological emphasis on the development of Afrikaners and South Africa's other ethnic groups, each as a separate folk, people, with distinct racial destinies. Very few black men and no black women had the franchise in 1948. Whites, who then made up about a quarter of South Africa's population, therefore determined the selection. They included both men and women, as white women had the franchise since 1930 as part of a state strategy to diminish the influence of the small number of black men with the vote. Women as well as men generated the ideas that animated Afrikaner nationalism. They highlighted the historical role of Afrikaners, most descendants of 17th century Dutch settlers in the Cape, in bringing Christianity and European civilization to Southern Africa. They mourned Afrikaners' history of oppression on the frontiers of a growing British Empire, particularly Britain's brutal treatment of women and children in the South African War a half-century before. They called for the urgent upliftment of poor Afrikaners to advance their race against the threat posed by the British-descended South Africans who had for the past century and a half exercised influence in politics and the economy on one hand, against the increasing threats from politically assertive black South Africans on the other. The black South Africans who so alarmed Afrikaner nationalists included men and women in the African National Congress and similar organizations advocating for rights for indigenous Africans, as well as other black people known as coloureds, mixed race, and Indians, descended from the indentured workers and immigrants who came to Natal from the 19th century. Women played key ideological roles in these groups, stressing their history of protecting their families against the depravities of colonialism and calling for black people to end white domination. But women also struggled against dismissal of their voices by the activist men who led these groups. Women, both black and white, similarly asserted themselves in the male-led Communist Party, which increasingly supported movements for racial equality in South Africa from the mid-1920s through its banning in 1950. It was important to the formation of apartheid policies that, despite the role of women at the grassroots of both Afrikaner and black movements, the leaders of the NP and its rivals in 1948 were all men. The spectre of black men unwilling to submit to white authority and the inability of the ruling United Party to make them submit loomed large in the NP's 1948 campaign. While the NP achieved its narrow victory with strong support from rural whites, it appealed to white fears of black men in cities. In South Africa, as across the continent in the wake of the Second World War, urban black men were at the helm of organizations that launched boycotts and strikes demanding their rights against white male leaders. The NP particularly feared the potential of activists to spread communism, destroying what they saw as Afrikaner Christian civilization. The NP's solution was to develop a white man's country, headed by Afrikaner patriarchs. Legislating sex and family, the foundations of apartheid. Foundational pieces of apartheid legislation tellingly targeted love and sex, demonstrating how control over sex was critical to the production and maintenance of racial difference. In 1949, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act barred marriages between Europeans, white South Africans including Afrikaners, British and other immigrants from Europe, and non-Europeans, African, coloured and Indian South Africans. It was followed by the Immorality Amendment Act of 1950, which prohibited sex between whites and all blacks. This extended the 1927 Immorality Act, which had already restricted sex outside of marriage between whites and Africans. The word native in the original act was replaced by the more encompassing non-European here. These broadening and hardening restrictions on intimacy revealed officials' sense that European civilization in southern Africa was under siege. The first place to shore it up was the family home. Interracial sex and marriage would remain illegal until 1985. Controlling intimacy entailed categorizing people. In the Immorality Amendment Act, the terms European and non-European were defined culturally. European means a person who in appearance obviously is, or who by general acceptance and repute is a European, and vice versa. Soon after, the Population Registration Act of 1950 established a national register to categorize each South African more bindingly by race and ethnicity. The accompanying Group Areas Act established the country's firm segregation along racial and ethnic lines, with specific groups restricted to specific regions and neighborhoods. Black married women's ethnicity followed that of their husbands. This legislation displaced black families from their homes and communities, as mixed neighborhoods such as Johannesburg's Sophia Town and Cape Town's District 6 were declared white areas. Ultimately, some 3.5 million black South Africans would be forced to move under apartheid. Families could also be separated when the race of their children fell in doubt. The apartheid state's struggle for control over racial reproduction manifested in family planning policies that urged white women to have children while encouraging black women to limit family size. Puritanical, DRC-influenced ideas of women's chastity discouraged by the pursuit of sexual pleasure and agency for all women. While abortion was illegal for all South African women, spectacular court cases concerned white rather than black women. Intrusive policies supported by many employers and the state required black women to have contraceptive injections to keep their jobs. Doctors employed sterilization far more readily for black women than for whites throughout the apartheid years. Black women's primary modes of employment, domestic service, farm labor, factory work, teaching, nursing, and clerical work, were not conducive to pregnancy, forcing many mothers to send their children to live with distant relatives. Due to black men's low wages, black women were much more likely to need to work than white women, connecting reproductive rights to labor issues. Ended labor policies were at the heart of apartheid, in intersection with marriage and household policies. To secure the labor of black men while limiting their experience in towns and cities declared to be predominantly white areas, the existing system of male migrant labor was further entrenched. This system had emerged with the development of diamond and gold mining over the latter half of the 19th century. Labor recruiters, chiefs, and rural African families sent young men to work in distant towns, while African women were to support rural families, leading to growing domestic tensions. From 1952, African men aged 16 or older legally had to carry identity documents called passes with them to justify their presence outside of the rural ethnic reserves to which officials consigned Africans. As the land in these reserves was insufficient in size and quality, men needed to work in urban areas to support themselves and their families and to pay taxes. They could generally only reside in urban areas as long as their passes attested to employment by whites, staying in hostels intended for temporary sojourns in segregated areas called townships. Exceptions were those who had been born in the urban area where they lived, who had lived in that area legally for 15 years, or who had worked for the same employer in that area for a decade. Such men and their dependents had Section 10 rights to live in urban townships as a family, as long as they were not deemed idle or undesirable. Most urban housing was deliberately unwelcoming to families who were supposed to remain in the countryside, eking out a living by women's farming to supplement the low wages received by migrant men. In rural areas filled increasingly with African women and children, the authority of male chiefs, both hereditary and appointed, reigned supreme. The Bantu Authorities Act of 1951 entrenched chiefly authority to administer customary law, a patriarchal system under which African women remained legal minors throughout their lives. Legal minor status meant that African women could not enter into contracts or own homes or other property in their own right. Children legally belonged to their fathers or male kin. Customary law collapsed and distorted diverse pre-colonial African legal systems in which women had generally held more authority, especially as they aged. The distorted power of traditional chiefs deepened in the 1960s. The promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959 provided the legal basis for the gradual development of self-governing Bantu national units out of the ethnic reserves to which Africans were consigned. In rural ethnic reserves formed, officials called them homelands or Bantustans, and in 1970, the Bantu Homeland Citizen Act declared Africans citizens of their homelands, not of South Africa. Reforms in the 1980s allowed for African women's growing emancipation from customary law. For instance, in 1981, the KwaZulu Bantustan introduced reforms so that adult women, married or unmarried, could legally own property and make other legal decisions following popular pressure. But African women continued to struggle against chiefly authority that privileged men. As wives, women were generally subject to their husband's authority. This was true not only for African women, but also for other black and white women. Unless they secured a prenuptial contract, The default through most of apartheid was that even privileged white women lost power to make legal decisions upon marriage. As mothers, however, women were charged with the critical responsibility of raising a new generation of workers and ethnic patriots. For Africans, this new generation was supposed to see their political futures not in white South Africa, but in their rural ethnic reserves. African mothers were to send their children to new state schools in an ethnically differentiated system called Bantu education, while Indian, colored, and white women were to send their children to distinct schools. At the crux of apartheid production and social reproduction, therefore, stood women, whom officials intended to be compliant wives and mothers in a segregated society. But increasing numbers of women refused to stand in their imposed places.